There we go. Um, so for this part here, I'm just going to jump back into my scene here, and I'm just going to work with what I have here, just so that you can sort of see the progression of where this might take me. So I have, this Nissan logos, nothing too particular here. I think I've seen some of what you guys have submitted already is way cooler than what I have here, which is really cool to see. Um, but yeah, so right now I have this simple sort of logo here, and I don't have any sort of lighting in here at all. It's just sort of plain environment, just sort of the default here. So if I hit Control R, I do have AO turned on, but you can see that right now, if I render to the picture viewer, doesn't look quite that good. So what I think I'm going to do is, I think I'm actually going to see if I can clean up the AO real fast, even before I add an environment, just so I can feel good about my render being a bit cleaner. The process that you go through for doing 3D is, unless you're working in a specific company in a studio with a workflow, is kind of up to you. So in this case, I'm going to change my render engine to physical. We've talked about these different render engines before for the extra credit, and some of you have gone about and done it. One of the options was to install Redshift. The other option that I mentioned was Arnold, because you can actually get an educational license for this. Arnold Renderer is the other one, and if you've seen any of the daily posts on Instagram or other social medias of people doing 3D renders, a lot of times they're using Octane Renderer. These two, Redshift and Octane, are GPU based, so you do need a graphics card in order to use them. Arnold is CPU, so you don't need that. But I'm just going to use physical because everyone has access to that. And just for the sake of what I'm doing here is I'm just going to change my sampler settings, which is basically the quality of my render. And I just want to see how this looks by default. So right now it looks pretty noisy, not very clean, and I can increase this number, and that should clean up my image more and more. Now, there's not much in my scene, so this is rendering pretty fast, but as you can see that this is starting to slow down. So depending on your machine and your system, this might be fast, this might be slow. So that's something that you can do just to sort of clean that up. So now that I know that that's possible to be cleaned up, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do something that we've sort of discussed before, and that's going to add in an HDRI environment, and that's really just going to give me reflections and or to how I'm going to use at this time lighting for my scene. So what we've done so far is we've come into our scene and we've add, say an area light, and we've positioned this where we want it to go. And I'm going to come into my other viewport here and position this particular light. You can see that the scene scale in here that my logo came in is actually quite small. Something to keep in mind is sometimes you want things to be scaled relatively realistically, just for the sake of making things act more appropriately. This doesn't matter as much in terms of when you're sort of doing your basic sort of compositions, but when we start to get into more animation and sort of more physically based rendering, which is technically what I'm using to render right now, it helps to have things sized relatively to scale. Again, it's still sort of the way that I'm using it right now, still sort of relative units to the world that we're in, but usually sometimes what I'll do is I'll just add a cube in my scene just to see how big my items are in comparison to that, because the cube is sort of our default item that we're using for scale. So you can see right now my logo is pretty small compared to my cube here. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm just going to select both of my objects here, put them in a group with Alt G, name this logo, and I'm just going to come over here to my scale. So that's the T key on my keyboard, and I'm just going to scale this up. Now, of course, there's a bunch of different ways I could do this. This is just one way that I'm choosing to do it right now. You could come over here and increase these numbers directly. That works sometimes. You could maybe adjust the splines before you even build your extrude object. There's a number of different ways that you can resize your items, as I'm sure a lot of you have already figured out. So now that I brought this up a little bit bigger, now I'm going to add my light just to sort of see how this works in my scene here. And before I tested this with an area light, and that's how we've been lighting a lot of our stuff so far. We've been using area lights, and we've been using sort of an environment in order to sort of get sort of reflections and just different sort of looks on our text itself. But this time what I'm going to do is, instead of just using my environment to sort of give me reflections, because right now I don't even have a reflective material. I mean, I think I have a basic reflectance of a little bit of the default specular, but it's not really shiny text or anything, not yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add in a sky object, which I'm sure some of you have already done, and I'm going to come over here and search for in the all section, and I'm in the asset browser, which you can access by pretty much the center of the UI here at the top of the viewport. And I'm just going to search for HDRI, and we got an HDRI in our scene. So I think I'm going to use, let's just add a new one in our scene. We'll add the cloudy sky, just because maybe that'll give us more even lighting. So now we have a cloudy sky in our scene, or a material for it, and I can apply this directly to my sky object here. And just for the sake of illustrating this point, I'm going to disable my current light in my scene and come into the view for my camera that I currently have, or my scene camera. So I'm actually going to add a camera in my scene as well, just so that I can actually make sure that I'm looking from the camera. So again, when you add in your HDRI image, the image in the background looks really cruddy because it's low res on purpose to save memory for your system. But for the sake of this, I'm just going to make it, I'm going to come into my material settings, my viewport settings, and just turn this to right there, 1K, just so I can see it. Of course, usually you wind up hiding this anyway, because unless your scene is supposed to be in this sort of environment, there's no need to see this, especially if we're going to composite it later on. But right now, if I render this, it doesn't really do much to my scene at all. It looks cool, and at this point I could just come up here, right click my sky object, go to where is it, rendering tags, compositing, and I can turn off scene by camera. And right now it doesn't really do anything. I have the default lights that Cinema 4D gives me. And to even illustrate my point even further, I'm actually going to go to my render settings, which is Control B shortcut, or just come up to the top here, and I'm going to go into my options here, and I'm actually going to turn off the default lights. So in here there are a bunch of different options that you can modify for your render of your choice, if you're using physical or the advanced renderer or standard renderer. And I'm just going to turn off the default lights. So right now, if I render this, I should see nothing because I have no lights in my scene, which makes sense. So what I'm actually going to do now is I'm actually going to come to my effects, and I'm actually going to turn on global illumination. So some of you might be familiar with this term, some of you might not be, but it's abbreviated a lot of times as just GI. And this is one way to add, as it might imply the name, illumination globally to your scene. So far we've been using a lot of direct lighting, such as you would do sort of say in a studio environment, but the world around us has light in various different forms, and this is one of the techniques that 3D programs use to illustrate or to create this sort of representation. There's a bunch of different ways of doing this, and some render engines, this is like a default thing, but in the default render engine for Cinema 4D, this is not, this is something that you actually have to turn on. So I'm going to add this into my scene, and without even changing anything, let's just render and see what things look like. So it looks like we got something coming in our scene. We have this sort of environmental light that has lit our text in this sort of interesting sort of global sort of way. So I have no lights active in my scene, yet because I have a sky object with an HDRI image, which high dynamic range image, applied to it, I'm able to globally light my scene. So I'm able to light my scene based off of this environment, which, if you recall, looks like this. So this environment with this sort of cloudy sky is providing this sort of lighting to my text right here. So this is sort of one way that you can globally sort of light your scene. And this doesn't work in all cases. Sometimes this works well, sometimes this doesn't. Sometimes this can increase your render times exponentially. I have a pretty fast machine here, so it's rendering pretty fast, but on your system your results may vary. And if, for example, I were to come over here, go to my physical render option settings here, and right now I'm on the setting of fixed and low. If I were to come over here and say go to medium, and I'm going to save my scene file here because it might crash. And if I hit the render shortcut key, which is Shift R for the viewport, now you can see that my render takes a little bit longer. Now, this may or may not come up on camera or on the capture here, but you should be able to see that when I switch back and forth, that there is, besides the fact that the background jumps in and out, even on the text, there's a visible quality difference in my render now from going from low to medium. So hopefully you can see that that sort of cleans up our text here. And if I were to say go to high settings, and let's give this a go. I'm going to save again in case it crashes. So you can see that the render is taking longer, and it's still going. Okay, so there we go. So you can see there that my render this time took about 11 seconds, which isn't too bad in the grand scheme of things. 11 seconds is, pretty quick, but when you're starting to get into animation and you have to render multiple frames, say 500 frames, it starts to add up over time. So we went from 2 seconds to 3 seconds to 11 seconds. So your render time does increase. And if I were to say maybe make both of my materials here reflective, just a little bit, turn off the default specular. Let's see how long my render takes now. So already we're almost over 11. So there you go. So now that we're okay, so if you're using Redshift, then you would using the Redshift ending, your settings might be a little bit different. So Redshift, for anyone who's not familiar, does a lot of what I'm doing now sort of by default. So these settings wouldn't necessarily help if you're doing Redshift. You would modify the Redshift settings in order to increase your render quality. Although the idea behind it is the same. You would add your different elements in your scene, you would add in your environment, and then Redshift by default would sort of add this sort of environmental effect to your scene. And then using Redshift, you would increase or decrease the quality. So similar process, just a different tool in order to receive your results. But as you can see here, this render here with just the text and just the reflections turned on, which this doesn't look particularly amazing or anything like that, took 1 minute and 4 seconds. So we went from 11 seconds to 1 minute. So something, if you continue to work in 3D, you'll have to keep in mind is just the amount of time it takes to render your scene. And this goes for pretty much any render engine you're using. Some render engines are faster than others in some aspects, depending on what you're trying to do. So for those of you who are using Redshift, it might be faster to get to this point, but there might be other things that Redshift is particularly, unfortunately, slower with. So, you can sometimes work things towards the strengths of what you're actually doing. But this is just showing you the process in general for using global illumination in your scene. Once we get to here, maybe we don't like how strong our reflections are. Maybe we want to blur them a bit, and anything that I'm doing right now might actually increase my render time. So I'm gonna mess with those settings there, and just for my own personal preference here, I'm gonna add a little bit of beveling to my text here. Maybe I'll make this sort of 1 in the rounding here, and I'm gonna turn my settings from high back to medium just so I can see how this renders. So now you can see that my render is going a little bit faster because I lowered the settings, but the quality does of course suffer a bit when you're doing something like this. But just like that, I'm able to sort of create an environment to look at my scene. Now, this is just using the HDRI images that are on the asset browser, but you're not limited to these. You can even go out and make your own HDRI images, or let's say you want to have something that looks like it's sitting on the desk in your room and you want to have accurate lighting. This is something that's used a lot in movies, of course. You would get a HDRI image of your environment, and then you would add that into your C4D scene file. But these are just the ones that you have here, which aren't really that many. So of course, you can of course Google like anything else and find some. But what I have set up is, did I put the link here? Oh, it looks like I didn't. So what I will do is I'll actually copy the link over here. So one place that you might want to go to get HDRI images, and I've mentioned this before, is called HDRI Haven. So let me copy this over here. So this is just one of the places that you can go in order to find HDRI images that are free that you can use in commercial applications. So these are all different HDRI images based off of different environments. I've used these on many projects, so these are definitely some things that you can use in your projects that you want to use if you want to have a specific look, if you want to have a nighttime scene for your environment, if you want to have an indoor sort of studio look for a scene. These are a whole bunch of different ones that you can have in order to use to sort of create the tone and feel for your scene that you choose. I'll put this over here because they did change their name recently. But yeah, so these are all different images, and let's say I wanted to have my text be in a sunset scene. And let's say I liked, this one looks interesting. It has sort of this rocky environment that's sort of purple and blue sort of haze. I could come into here and they give you a bunch of different images that you can download. They have 4K settings. These specifically, they also have EXRs that you can use as well, which is another format that also is works for HDRI images. So I could just come over here, hit download, and I'm going to make sure that I put this in the folder over here. And I'm just going to put this in a text folder because I know that C4D is going to create this later on. As soon as my window here comes back to me. Might be because I'm doing a lot at the same time. Hopefully it doesn't crash on me. There we go. So let me just save this into my scene folder here, and I just left it at the 4K amount here because that was sort of the default it has. But if you want to use a higher resolution image, you can feel free to go for 4K is usually enough for me and what I need to do. But it all depends on your workflow. Some movies use 8, 16K, different size images. So now that I've downloaded this EXR that I'm going to use as a HDR image, I can come back into Cinema 4D, and I'll show you doing this from scratch. Is you just make a new material, you go into your material, HDRI is what I'm going to name this, and I would turn off the color channel because I don't need that, turn off the reflectance because I don't need that, go into my luminous channel, enable that, And then this is where I need to find the new image that I just downloaded. So now I would go into my folder here. And so question is, so I didn't put it in my folder. So let me make sure that's in my folder here. So now I have this image in my scene. So now I can replace the material that I currently have in my sky, and you'll see a little bit of a change in the viewport, but as you can see here, this image is in my scene. And again, if I wanted it to look a little bit better, I can go into my viewport settings on my material, and this time I just put it to no scaling, and I can put back on my compositing tag that hides it. Now if I render to my viewport, give it a second here, now you can see that my whole text has a whole different feel to it. So you can really shape the mood of your objects inside of Cinema 4D using this method. Of course, you don't have to use this sort of lighting on your objects. This is just one way to get sort of a global feel, a global lighting on your objects. And this doesn't have to do with just text. You know, this applies to any sort of objects you add into your scene. If you add a figure, and this figure right now doesn't have any materials, it just has the default scene material on it. You see that it has sort of the look and feel of the environment that we loaded in here. Excuse me. So if you wanted it to have this sort of, you know, sunset purple haze look, this is something that you might go for, or of course you can go with other ones, and you don't have to use ones that are actually environments. You can use ones that are more studio based, which is more sort of your default sort of lighting. So if I add this into my scene here and just add this on top of my sky, you can see already that the color information in my scene is a lot more muted. So if you wanted to sort of have a more controlled environment and let your materials do the talking per se in terms of what color they actually are, you might want to go with more of a studio HDRI image. So this is a really potentially quick way to add lighting in your scene. Sometimes it makes your renders a lot longer, sometimes not, and you know, it all depends on what you're going for. This is just one of the techniques that you can use. And again, you can do this in other render engines. If you're using Redshift, you can do this in Redshift. It's using the dome light specifically is what it is. If you're using Arnold Renderer, you can use that one as well to do the same technique. It's just a couple less buttons depending on what render engine you're actually using. But again, you can do this all in the default Cinema, so don't feel like you have to go out of your way to get another program or install another thing. Everyone who has access to Cinema 4D can go through this process towards creating their logo. So if this is something that I was, say, really happy with, maybe I come over here, turn back up my reflections just a little bit because I've sort of neutralized things, and let's say I wanted to have this ready to bring this into Photoshop so I could composite it, or even just Illustrator. I can come over to my save settings, maybe set this as PNG. If you are compositing this in the program, then the format doesn't matter as much because you're going to be exporting it out of Photoshop or whatever as a PNG or a JPEG so that it can be used on the web. But just for the sake of keeping consistent, I'm going to choose PNG. I can turn on the alpha channel, and then I would choose a place that I'm actually going to render this to. So let's say I go here, and that's going to be the path that I'm using to render. So now if I hit Shift R or render to the picture viewer, I'll give it a couple seconds here to figure out the global illumination because it has to actually calculate everything, and the short version of the calculations is basically figuring out how the light bounces off whatever the object is in order to reflect light onto itself again and again. There's a lot more math and science that goes into it, but that's a super short version of it. So right now my text is rendering, and you can see global illumination is definitely slowing things down just a little bit here, but depending on what you're going for, the results that you get might be really well worth it. There's probably a lot of tweaking I would do specifically to the bottom here, because for me personally, the bottom looks like it's more washed out, so there's nothing saying that you can't add more lights into your scene. So just because I want this to be a little bit better, I'm going to say put this on preview just so I can do faster previews here. And let's say I just turn back on the light that I had from before, and I'm using what's now called the interactive render region, and that just allows me to more quickly preview what I see in my scene without having to wait for the full render. It is a little bit lower quality than the final render, so that's why it renders a little bit faster, and a lot of different render engines have this in them or have this built into them. So if you're using a different render engine, you have something similar to this as well. That's a little bit better. Definitely a lot more work that can be gone into this per se, but just for the sake, we'll say that this is good enough. I'm going to tell it to override what I previously had. And I'm going to give this a second to process. And there we go. We'll say that that works for what we're trying to go for. And now if we check our folder, which apparently I didn't save in my renders folder, I just saved it with the name renders. If I check out my file, now I have my, oh, if it opens up for me, there we go. There we go. So now I have my 3D text that I can bring inside of a compositing program of my choice in order to add a background. I could maybe, add some levels to this to make sure that this pops a bit more, since it's kind of dull and receded right now. There's nothing to say that you can't keep modifying your stuff afterwards, or maybe, I wind up not liking this when I actually see it rendered out, and that's totally cool too. Now I can see that and I can go back and fix it later on. But that's how I could go about sort of adding global illumination to your render to sort of add a specific tone and look to your scene. You don't have to do it this way. If you feel you have more control just adding a whole bunch of different lights in your scene and maybe just using your HDRI image as reflections, that's totally something that is okay to do. It's really up to you and what sort of look and what style you want to go for. So that's just one particular extra little bit here that I wanted to show to everyone. Again, this is just one technique that you can use, and we'll talk about probably a couple other ones as we go across here. And if anyone has any specific, things that they want to learn, I did mention the poll, so you can put them in the poll, but of course feel free to bring them up at any time. If there's something that you see online that you want to, maybe you're curious about how to actually do it, feel free to bring it up. But yeah, so that's sort of the global illumination part of this little bit that I wanted to show everyone. Just some general things to keep in mind. Just think about your design, your color choice, your composition. Those go a lot into developing your design, regardless of what your design is going to be, or how you might use these skills in the future. If you're doing character work, if you're doing ad work, if you're doing more illustrative work, these are just general things to keep in mind in terms of readability and understanding and design language, as they always say. Just keep in mind that when you're figuring out what your final design is actually going to be, where text is going to be, how readable it is, how it stands out from the background, or maybe how it recedes into the background because you're trying to blend it all together. There's a bunch of different things you can keep in mind in terms of your brand project that you're going to work on. So that's the sort of lesson 2 here. There's no interactive part for this part, since we've been going for a bit here. So the last thing that I want to cover here, before I let everyone go for today here, is just a little recap of what you're actually due for next week. So again, this is the beginning of your Studio Project 1, your branded 3D social media ad or advert. There are 2 parts, and next week you're only due the first part of this. So the first part is to pick your brand, which if you've done the in-class stuff today, maybe you already have your brand picked. Maybe you already have figured out your intended message. But that's going to be one of the things that's going to be due for next week. And then the second part of that for next week is a sketch, a design, or you could do it digitally if you want to, or if you're not comfortable with doing a more illustrative type of design, you can write out an outline of what your design is actually going to be. So it could be a logo in space shooting off a rocket that's going to potentially have explosions in the background. It's totally cool if that's how you're going to envision your design. I've shown my little scribbles before, so you totally are welcome to do something on this level if that's sort of where you're at, or it could be way better than this. It's always cool to see how people plan out their projects and their designs, because any bit of pre-planning you can do goes a really long way in figuring out what your final result's going to be. There's really not can be understated too much. That's why people pay for storyboard artists and illustrator and previs artists. So that in itself is its own big industry. So yeah, thank you for the question. So what I mean by the goal in your message is just sort of what are your goals for the advert that you're creating? Is it just for brand awareness, or is it to sell people new skate shoes? Is it to sell people on, Pepsi Cola that is better than, the other brand? Whatever the brand is, you can totally make it up, or it could be more practical in a sense as well. It could just be, I want people to play this video game because it's really cool. That's totally fine for the intended goal or message. So it's pretty much up to you. I'm not limiting you in what it's going to be. Totally. One sentence is totally fine. It doesn't have to be, I'm not asking for like a paragraph. It's just this, you can keep it simple, straight to the point, or if you have more, of a brand sort of a mock-up that you're trying to go for, that totally can work as well. But as long as you can convey the message to me of what it is you're trying to go for, that works. That's full marks there. So if anyone has any questions about that, please let me know. And if you think of them later on, just get in touch. So that's what's going to be due next week. So just 2 parts of this first part of the submission. You don't even need C4D for any of this. Of course, if you do want to get a jump on your assignment, which some of you may have already if you've used your brand logo in the class today, so you might already have a good idea of how it's going to actually develop, and that's totally cool. But for next week, all I need is this here, which is just the message, your goal, what brand you're going to do. So, Nike or, League or whatever the brand is going to be, just let me know what it is. And then a design or an outline. Your outline, if you're doing words for your design outline, that might be more than 1 sentence, because you might need to describe it in a bit more words. So the outline, if you're doing that in words, that might need to be more than 1 sentence, unless it's like super simple, which that may or may not work. So that's the whole point of this, is to sort of figure this out, and it doesn't have to be super finalized, but at least it lets me know that you're on the right track, and that's what's going to be due next week. So let me know if anyone has any questions on that. Just to put it in focus, this is a 2-part assignment, so the week after that, the final version of the project will be due. But for next week, this is all you need to have. Just your message, the brand, and something that tells me what your design is actually going to be. So that's what's going to be due next week. If anyone has any questions along the week that they thought of later on, just get in touch with me. Hopefully this all makes sense to you. But yeah, so that's going to be it for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me in class. I hope everyone has a good weekend.